Some things in the woods shouldn't exist, not because they're dangerous, but because they were never meant to be found. Once there was a 29-year-old man named Ethan. He was traveling for work, and while he was staying in a remote part of Oregon, he decided to spend one of his afternoons doing something he always enjoyed. He went for a hike. At first, it was completely normal. Just trees, the sound of wind moving through the branches, and miles of forest stretching in every direction. Then he noticed something that absolutely shouldn't have been there. Deep in the middle of the forest, there was a door, just standing there, completely alone. No walls, no building, no structure attached to it. Just an old wooden door standing upright among the trees as though it had somehow always belonged there. Ethan stopped walking. For a moment, he simply stared at it. At first, he figured it had to be some kind of art project, or maybe remains of an abandoned house. The problem was, there was nothing else around it. No signs, no trail markers, no explanation, just the door. The longer he looked at it, the stranger it felt. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. So he walked over and reached for the handle. He expected to see more forest on the other side. But instead, he saw something that he could not explain. When he opened the door, he saw what appeared to be a void of darkness. Not a dark room, not a shadow, just darkness. A pitch-black void so complete that he couldn't tell where it ended. He leaned forward slightly, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. Then he heard something. At first, he wasn't even sure what it was. Just a faint sound somewhere inside that darkness. Then it clicked. Footsteps. Slow at first, then a little faster, getting closer, as though whatever was inside had noticed the door was open. Ethan slammed the door shut and stumbled backward. His heart was pounding, and for the next few seconds he just stood there staring at the door, trying to convince himself he hadn't actually heard what he thought he heard. The entire walk back felt wrong. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about what he had just seen, or what he had heard. The footsteps kept replaying in his mind. Every time he tried to come up with a reasonable explanation, it fell apart. By the time he made it back to his Airbnb, he had more questions than answers. So that night, he decided he would start searching for answers online. At first, he didn't find much. Mostly stories about abandoned buildings and strange places people had stumbled across in the woods. But the deeper he dug, the stranger things became. Eventually, he started finding stories about doors. Not normal doors. Doors standing completely alone in forests. Some people believed they were connected to ancient ritual sites. Others claimed they were tied to old druid ceremonies or occult practices hidden deep in the wilderness. There were dozens of theories. Some people believed they were portals. Others thought they connected different places, different times, or even different worlds. Most of it sounded ridiculous. At least it should have. But the more Ethan read, the harder it became to dismiss what had happened. The thing that bothered him wasn't the folklore. It was the fact that none of it explained what he experienced. The door should have opened to more forest. Instead, it opened to darkness. And something inside that darkness had been moving toward him. Ethan wasn't a spiritual person. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in the supernatural. He was an atheist. But none of those beliefs changed what happened. And eventually, curiosity won. He had to know what was behind that door. The next day, he went back. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought a colleague from work named Brandon. Brandon was the kind of person who got along with everyone. Easygoing, friendly, the sort of guy who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 10 new friends. Over the course of the trip, he and Ethan had become pretty close. Ethan didn't tell him everything. He just said he had found something strange in the woods and wanted another opinion. Brandon agreed almost immediately. A few hours later, the two of them were hiking back through the forest. And before long, they found it. The door was still there, standing exactly where Ethan remembered it. Brandon stopped and laughed. "No way. You actually found one." "You've seen these before?" Ethan asked. "I've heard stories online," Brandon said. "Never thought I'd actually find one." He stepped closer to the door. "Did you open it?" Ethan hesitated. "Yeah." "And?" Ethan shook his head. "Honestly, it was kinda crazy. I don't think you would believe me unless you see for yourself. But I think there's something inside there," Ethan said. "I brought a gun in my book bag just because I wasn't fully sure, but it's unlike anything you would expect to see." That answer only made Brandon more curious. He reached for the handle. "Well, let's see how crazy it really is." Slowly, Brandon pulled the door open. And immediately, both men froze. The darkness was still there. The same impossible darkness Ethan had seen the day before. Brandon leaned forward slightly. Then his expression changed. "I hear something." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "What?" "Footsteps." The two men looked at each other. For a second, neither of them said anything. The footsteps were unmistakable. Something was moving somewhere inside that darkness. Brandon pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight. Then he aimed the beam into the void. At first, nothing happened. The light seemed to disappear into the darkness. Then suddenly, the beam caught something. Brandon squinted. "Wait." "What?" Ethan asked. "I can see something." As he moved the flashlight, more details started to appear. First, a floor. Concrete. Then walls. A narrow hallway stretching away into the darkness. Brandon looked back at Ethan. "Look. It's just a hallway." A grin spread across his face. "We'll prop the door open and take a quick look," Brandon said. "We will take the gun with us, and if something happens, we can just run back out and slam the door shut." Simple. At least that's how Brandon saw it. The more mysterious the door became, the more determined he was to know what was behind it. Curiosity had completely overridden caution. Brandon was very ballsy and was just so curious. But Ethan wasn't nearly as enthusiastic. Everything about this felt wrong. The darkness, the footsteps, the fact that a hallway somehow existed behind a door standing in the middle of the woods. But at the same time, he had spent an entire night wondering what was on the other side. Now he finally had a chance to find out. So he agreed. Using a large tree branch, they wedged the door open so it couldn't swing shut behind them. Then the two men stepped through. The temperature dropped immediately. The hallway was cold. Not cool. Cold. The kind of cold that settles into your skin. Concrete walls surrounded them on both sides. The flashlight beams barely seemed to push back the darkness ahead. And aside from their footsteps, the place was completely silent. For about a minute, they walked forward. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't really anything to say. Nothing about the situation made sense. Then the hallway opened up. The narrow passage gave way to a large room. And the moment both men stepped inside, the room lit up. Neither of them touched anything. There were no switches, no visible lights. Yet somehow the entire room illuminated itself. It almost felt as though the room knew they had entered. Both men stopped, slowly looking around. The room itself was empty, completely empty, except for one thing. Right in the center of the floor, there was a massive hole, perfectly round, far larger than either of them expected, and so deep that the bottom wasn't visible. The darkness inside somehow looked even deeper than the hallway had. Ancient-looking symbols had been carved into the concrete around the edge. Neither Ethan nor Brandon recognized them. For several seconds, they just stared. Wow. Ethan shook his head. This is actually insane. Brandon laughed nervously. No one is ever going to believe us. And honestly, he was probably right. The two men spent the next few minutes trying to figure out what they were looking at. An old bunker? A ritual site? Some abandoned government project? Every explanation sounded ridiculous. But none of them sounded more ridiculous than the truth. Eventually, Brandon started patting his pockets. Ethan frowned. What are you doing? Brandon looked toward the hole. I want to see how deep it is. Brandon reached into his pocket and pulled out a pen. It wasn't exactly scientific, but it was enough for a quick test. Without giving it much thought, he stepped closer to the edge and tossed the pen into the hole. The two men listened and waited to see if they could hear the pen hit the bottom of the pit. An impact, an echo, anything. But there was nothing. No sound at all. The pen simply vanished into the darkness. Several more seconds passed. Brandon looked at Ethan. Okay. That's weird. Ethan nodded. Yeah. A moment later, something hit the floor behind them. Both men jumped. The sound echoed through the room. They turned around. Something was lying on the concrete between them. For a second, Ethan didn't recognize it. Then he realized what he was looking at. The pen. It had come back. While neither of them moved. Slowly, Brandon crouched down and picked it up. The pen was ruined, bent, crushed. As if something unimaginably strong had squeezed it in the middle. For several seconds, neither man said a word. The room suddenly felt a lot less empty. Then something else happened. A faint glow appeared around the edge of the hole. Both men immediately noticed it. The symbols carved into the concrete had started glowing. At first, it was barely visible. Just a faint light creeping through the carvings. Then it grew brighter and brighter. The floor beneath their feet began vibrating. Dust drifted from the ceiling overhead. A crack appeared in one of the walls. Then another. The entire room shuddered violently. Pieces of concrete broke loose and crashed to the floor. The sound echoed through the chamber. Neither Ethan nor Brandon needed to discuss it. The decision was obvious. Let's get out of here. The shaking became even more violent. Concrete rained down from above. The room looked like it was tearing itself apart. The two men hurried around the edge of the hole, heading back toward the hallway. They had almost made it. Then the floor shifted beneath Brandon's feet. It happened so fast that Ethan barely had time to react. 1 second, Brandon was running beside him. The next second, he slipped. His arms shot out instinctively, trying to catch himself. But there was nothing there. Ethan watched in horror as Brandon stumbled toward the edge of the pit. For a split second, it looked like he might recover. Then he disappeared over the side, screaming as he flew down the dark pit. "Brandon!" Ethan shouted. But the darkness swallowed him instantly. And just like that, he was just gone. Ethan froze. His brain struggled to process what had just happened. A moment earlier, Brandon had been right beside him. Now there was nothing. He rushed toward the hole. "Brandon!" Ethan shouted again and again. But no answer. Then another section of the ceiling collapsed nearby. Concrete exploded across the floor. The room was coming apart. The symbols around the hole were glowing brighter than ever. And for the first time since entering the room, Ethan felt genuinely terrified. Not confused, not curious, terrified. And he knew that if he stayed any longer, he was going to die there too. Ethan turned and ran. There wasn't really a decision to make anymore. The room was collapsing. Brandon was gone. And every instinct in his body was telling him to get out. Chunks of concrete crashed down around him as he sprinted toward the hallway. The vibrations had become so violent that he could barely keep his footing. Behind him, the glowing symbols continued to pulse around the edge of the hole. For a brief moment, Ethan thought he heard something else coming from the darkness. But he didn't stop to find out. He ran. Back through the hallway. Past the cold concrete walls. Toward the only exit he knew existed. Finally, he saw it. The doorway. A rectangle of daylight waiting at the far end of the corridor. Ethan pushed himself even harder. A second later, he burst through the door and stumbled into the forest. He hit the ground hard. Leaves and dirt scattered beneath him. He ran to slam the door shut. Then for several seconds, he just sat there trying to catch his breath. Everything was quiet again in the middle of the woods. No shaking. No crashing concrete. No distant vibrations. Just silence. Ethan sat there in shock, looking down as he began to tear up over his friend. Then, slowly, Ethan looked up and then back over his shoulder. And his stomach dropped. He couldn't believe what he saw. The door was gone. The branch they had used to prop it open was gone too. In fact, there was nothing there at all. No doorway. No opening. No sign that anything had ever existed in that spot. Just trees. Endless trees. Ethan stood there staring in disbelief. A few minutes earlier, he and Brandon had walked through that door together. Now it was as though it had never been there at all. Brandon became a missing person and was never found. Search teams spent days combing through the forest. Then weeks. Then months. Nothing. No trace. No evidence. No explanation. Ethan told everyone exactly what had happened. The police, investigators, Brandon's family, anyone willing to listen. But the story sounded impossible. A mysterious door in the woods. A hallway hidden behind it. A room with a bottomless hole. And a friend who simply vanished. Without evidence, nobody could prove any of it had happened. And eventually, most people stopped asking questions. But Ethan never stopped thinking about it. Because no matter how many years passed, sometimes he wondered if he should have walked away that first day. If he had simply left the door alone. But Ethan couldn't walk away from what happened. After Brandon vanished, it became his obsession to find out where his friend had gone and what that door really was. He told his story to anyone who would listen. The police, reporters, strangers on the internet, trying to convince someone, anyone, that he wasn't crazy. Most people dismissed him. But on one late night, on a small paranormal forum where he'd posted his experience, someone finally took him seriously. Then another. A few people wrote that they believed him. They said his friend might not be dead at all. That doors like the one Ethan found have been linked to places outside our reality. Other dimensions. Other points in time. They shared stories of travelers who stepped through a door and never came back. And a few who did, years later, insisting only a few minutes had passed. The details were different. The locations were different. But the one thing they all agreed on was simple. Those doors are not accidents, and they are never harmless. So the next time you're deep in the woods and you see a door standing by itself where nothing should be, you can walk up to that door and you can put your hand on the handle. You can open it and see what's waiting on the other side. Or you can keep walking and pretend you never saw it and leave it for someone else to find. Just know this. If Ethan is right, and if those people on that forum are right, then some doors don't just lead to other rooms. They lead to places you were never meant to go. And once you cross that threshold, you may not get the chance to come back and tell anyone what you found. If you have made it this far in the video, thank you for watching The Midnight Archive. If this story unsettled you, subscribe for more horror stories drawn from legends, folklore, and places that should have stayed forgotten. You can also find more stories on Spotify under The Midnight Archive. Thank you for listening. Good night. And sleep well.